Hey, what's up YouTube? Welcome to part 2 of this 4-part series. And if you are new and haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you do that. But if you already have everything configured, your Auth.js and your database and Prisma ORM set up, then you are in the right place. And what we're going to do in this video is we are going to build out our Google provider and the credentials provider. And then we're also going to make custom pages. Instead of using the pre-built pages they give us, we are going to make a custom page, and the credentials provider is only for when the user log in. So we actually do need to create a register endpoint, an API, and actually register the user into our database, and then use the credentials provider to see if we should let them be logged in or not. So let's jump into it. And before we get started, if you guys can, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and also subscribe for more content just like this. So first, we're going to start with the Google provider. And what the Google provider does, it takes in 2 options or arguments, however you want to call it. And the first one is going to be the client ID. And you want to store the value of the client ID inside of a env file. So to do this, just type in process.env and then name it whatever you want. We can name this Google _client _ID, and then we'll put a comma. And then the next thing is going to be the client secret. And then we could do almost something very similar, Google _client _secret. Now let's just copy both these and then paste them in our .env so we know we're not messing up the spelling. And then that's correct. So we have the Google and then they're both in here. So now next is we have to get these 2 values, and to get these we have to do that inside of the Google Cloud Console. So let's go over to Google, and we're going to open up a new tab and type in Cloud Console. And it should be the first website that pops up, and you should land on a page something similar to this. And if you don't, it's because you're not logged into a Gmail account. Next, we are going to come up here to the top, and there should be a drop down, or if you don't have any projects, it might say create new project here instead. But click this, and we're going to click new project, and we can name this Auth.js version 5 tutorial app. We don't need any organization, so we're going to click create. And as you can see, it is loading our project right here. So we're going to wait for this project to load, and then we're going to click select project, and you can see it's selected up here. Next, you're going to go to APIs and services, and we are going to create an OAuth consent screen. So we're going to click this, and our user type is going to be external, so anybody can test our application, not internal. So we're going to click create. We're going to give it an app name. And as you can see here, this is how the info is going to be presented to the user on the consent screen. And this is the information that you're typing in here. So this is going to be the name of the app asking for consent. That's usually the company name or the app's name that you created. For us, we are just going to do auth tutorial. The user support email is going to have a drop down, and it's going to be the email that you are logged into a Gmail. Next, the app logo, you don't have to do this now. I recommend skipping it. You could always come back and add a logo later. And other than that, you can skip all of the other steps except for the developer contact information. I would use the same email or another email that you have access to and click save and continue. Next is step 2, the scopes. So the scopes express the permissions you request users to authorize for your app and allow your project to access specific types of private user data from their Google account. So we're going to add the first 3 scopes. So we're going to see your primary Google account email address. So we want to see the email. We want to see your personal info, including any personal info you've made publicly available. So any publicly available info, and associate you with your personal info on Google. So those are going to be the 3 scopes we add, and we're going to click update. And they should pop up right here, and then we could scroll all the way down, click save and continue. And the third step is if you want to have any test users, we don't, so we're just going to click save and continue. And then it's a summary to make sure everything is correct that we added. So everything looks good. So all we have to do is click back to dashboard. Next, we are going to go to the credentials tab right here. And now we are going to click create credentials, and it is going to be a OAuth client ID. So this is going to request user consent so your app can access the data. So the application type, it's going to be a web application. The name can be whatever you want. This is going to be the name of your OAuth 2 client. The name is only used to identify the client in the console and will not be shown to the end users. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say auth tutorial. And another thing we are going to do is the authorized JavaScript origins. So this is going to be for use with requests from a browser. So what we can do here is we could just do HTTP localhost 3000. And then this is also too where you can add your production domain as well when you get production. So you could always come back and edit any of the things we are editing now. So don't worry about it. And we do need a redirect URI. And what this is, it's going to, after they log in, we are going to have a endpoint that Auth.js provides us that we have to enter in here. If you don't do that, you're going to get thrown an error. So for us, it's going to be HTTP localhost 3000 /API /auth /callback and then / the provider. So in this case, it's Google. So that is the redirect URI for Google. And if we do go to their documentation, I want to see if you guys could see it right here. So the callback URL, it's going to be the origin, so your localhost 3000, API, auth, callback, and then Google. So if you do look over in our code again, you can see we have this catch all route. So it's API auth, and then it's a catch all route. So any endpoints that at least include this, we are going to export a get and post request from @auth, which is where we're defining all of our Auth.js version 5 stuff here. And that is why this endpoint that we added to the Cloud Console is going to work, because we made that endpoint inside of our code using the catch all route. So next we could just click create. And now we get our client ID and our client secrets. So I'm going to copy the client ID. We're going to go to the .env and we're going to paste it here. Let's go back. Let's get the client secret. Let's paste it here. And now we have the client secret and the ID. And it should be in this type of format as well for you. So you could just press OK. And then if you go to enabled APIs and services, if you go back to the credentials, you can see the OAuth 2.0 client IDs, the ones we created. And the OAuth consent screen is the one we have already created as well. So these are the two things you need to do to get the Google provider up and running. So now let's test it out to see if it's actually working. So what we're going to do is we are going to open up our terminal. So npm run dev. And we are going to use the pre-built checkout sign-in page that Auth.js provides us. So let's wait for this to compile. Taking a little longer than usual, but okay, let's go to it. And let's go to that specific endpoint, right? So we have /API, /auth, and then sign in. Okay, so we have sign in with Google. And we did reset the server because after you change the env file, if you haven't reset the server, make sure you do. And what we're going to do is we're going to click sign in with Google. So now we don't get an error thrown at us. We actually are going to sign in, and it's asking you to choose an account to continue with the auth tutorial. So that's the name we gave it. So we're going to click our email, click continue. And then there's a problem with the server configuration. Let's check the server log. So let's see what we have done wrong. So it has something to do with the Prisma ORM. So there's an invalidation error. So when we created the user, we need to let the Prisma generate the ID because of our default UID is incompatible with MongoDB. As you can read, it says argument password is missing. So password, we're not going to get back from the Google provider. That's only going to be in the credentials provider. And I did do a mistake at the beginning. We did make it required. So we do have to put this as optional. And this is a good learning point here. So what we can do is, I'm hoping that's the only error. So let's stop our server. And if you make any changes to your schema.prisma file, like I just did here, I added the optional, you have to run npx prisma generate. This is going to update the Prisma client, which is what we use inside of our code. So it's going to update that. And then we have to push it to our database too. So we're going to say npx prisma db push. And these are the two commands you always have to run if you make any changes to your database. So now let's run npm run dev. And we can also check our database while we're at it to make sure no user got created, which I'm pretty sure nothing did. So nope, no users created. So we have an empty database. We have the localhost 3000 running. Let's go back to the endpoint. So /API auth, and then it's sign in. Let's sign in with Google. And there's a problem still with the server configuration. So let's check out the error again. So if we look at our terminal, okay, so it's saying the unknown argument of image. And as you can see, it is giving us an image. And if I do just control click on this and open it, you're going to see it is my Google profile image. And if we do look at our model again, so let's look at the model. We don't have the image field anywhere. We don't have that image argument anywhere within any of our models. So we are going to add it to the user model, and we're going to say image, and it's going to be an optional string because as you can see the type here, when you look at it, it is a string with the URL to the image. So now let's try it again. Let's press Control C. Let's do npx prisma generate. And do npx prisma db push. And then what we can do from here is npm run dev. And I'm definitely not cutting this stuff out because part one, if you did follow step by step, you're going to have to add these two fields in. So the two fields that we did add is going to be the password, which is a optional string. We just didn't have an optional. And then we were passing in a whole new argument of image, and it's going to be an optional string as well inside of the user model. So let's see if it's going to work this time. Hopefully it does. Let's go back to localhost 3000 and that specific endpoint. Let's sign in with Google. Let's click my account. And it looks like it redirected us back to the home page with no error. So if we look at our console, our server logs, it looks like we had a 200 request, a status of 200, and a 302. So that means something was created and we had a 200. So it looks like everything went correct. But let's just verify with our database. So in our database, we now have a user with a name, an email verified of null, a image, which is a Google image, the created at field, and the updated field. And then we also have an account because this is the account that's associated with the Google provider. So that is how you set up the Google provider. Make sure your model, obviously like I did, make sure your model is correct. And any of the updates that we've done in here, make sure you reflect them in your code. And if you do have any errors, make sure you read the server consoles to see what the actual error is and try to think about it logically, or you can ask me a question in the comments section, or you could join my Discord room and I'll get to those as soon as I can. But this is how the Google provider works. And I'm going to show you how you can actually implement it with your own UI and UX instead of that pre-built sign-in page. But next, let's go and work on the credentials provider, then work on creating the custom UI. So to actually start working on the credentials provider, we do need to create a register form and functionality using a server action. And the reason why is because the credentials provider only allows us to authenticate users, and to do that, we need a user that is registered in the database to actually authenticate. So first we are going to go to our app, And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. And we're going to call this register. So this is going to be the register page. And we are going to have a page.tsx. It's going to be tsx. And then we want to keep this page to be a server component. So we are going to do RAFC, which is going to create a React arrow function. And what we're going to name this page, we could just name this register page. And then inside of the register page, we are going to render a register form. So instead of this div, what we can do is we could register form like this, self-closing. And we haven't created this component yet. So what we can do is inside the root layer of our application, we can create a components folder. But before you create the components folder, I do want to initialize Shadcn. So Shadcn we're going to use their components for the UI, and we're going to use the use form hook inside of Shadcn. So we're going to be able to send data back to our server action that is type safe using Zod. So let's go to Google and let's open up a new tab and let's search Shadcn. And then let's just go to the installation tab and click Next.js. And the first thing we need to do is we need to initialize Shadcn with the init command. So we could just do npm. Let's go over to our project, open up the terminal, and then run this command. And then what this is going to do, it's going to prompt you to a few questions that you have to answer based on how you want your project to be. So let's give this a few seconds. Okay, so we're doing version 2.1.7. We're going to say, okay, to proceed. We're going to press Y. And which style would you like to use? I picked New York. Which color would I like to use? I'm going to put neutral. Would you like to use CSS variables for theming? We're going to say yes. And now it's going to write the components.json file. So you're going to get this new file. It's going to update your Tailwind config file. And it's also going to update your app globals.css file and install dependencies. And it looks like you're using React 19. Some packages may fail to install due to peer dependencies, issues, and NPM. So how would you like to proceed? We're going to use force. So it's going to install the dependencies and everything should work out correctly. And it looks like it was successful and also created a lib folder with the utils.ts file. Okay, so next let's get a few of the components that we are going to need. And like I said, we are going to use a bunch of components from Shadcn. So what we can do is we can run the command npx shadcn add. And if you go to the documentation, one of the things we could add is we are going to add a button. So on the button, you can see the command here, npx shadcn at latest add button. So I didn't do it correct, but we could copy it here. And let's paste this command in our terminal. And what this is going to do, it is going to get a button from Shadcn and give you the source code. So that means you can style the button how you want, and it's going to create a components folder. And inside that, there's a UI folder with a button.tsx. So as you can see, here is all the source code, and you can make changes, and then you can import the button at the top of any page that you want to use it. And then you'll be able to use the different variants and styles that it comes with in the source code. Okay, so what I want to do is now that I have the components folder, we are going to add more components from Shadcn. But first, let's create this register form page so we can stop getting this error. Inside the components folder, I want to create another folder called auth. And inside of the auth, we are going to create a register form.tsx. So this register form.tsx, this is going to be the use client because there is going to be some client-side interactivity and hooks that we're going to need to use for this to be client-side. And then I wanted to make the register page a server page, so that's why it's getting imported here. So let's make sure we do create a function, and we could call it register form. We're exporting it as default, so let's import it here at the top. And so now there's no error on this page, and then the register form page is going to render on the register page. So what I am going to do is I'm going to copy all of the imports that we need at the top. because a lot of this is CSS and Tailwind, and this tutorial isn't really about the styling, but you are going to be able to get the styles from my GitHub repo that will be in the description, and I'll explain what's going on. So let me import all the imports at the top from where I'm getting this from, my other project. And as you can see, we have a form from Shadcn, the React hook form. So those are two imports from Shadcn. I have a component called a card wrapper. We are using the Zod resolver. We have a schema folder, input component. We have Zod. We have the button. We have use state. We have the register action. We have a form success and a form error component. And we also have a Google login component as well. So what we're going to do is let's get all of these imports and components from Shadcn. So next one could be the form. So let's get the form and run the initialization. So let's open the terminal, run the command to get the form. And if you're not using React 19, you're not going to get this. Would you like to use force? It's only if you're using React 19. So if you look at the components, what we got is we got the form and a label. And so if you look, we have the use form from React hook form. So we have that package, and we also have all of the form components like the form control, the description, the field, the item, label, and message, what we just got here. Another thing we need is the input component. And that looks like it's the only component left from Shadcn that we need on the register page. So let's get input and let's install it with the CLI. And as you do this, obviously you're going to see what errors are going away and which ones aren't. So now we have the input. And if it doesn't update in time, you can press Control-Shift-P and then just search for TypeScript, restart TypeScript server. It's going to restart it, and you could tell it's initializing the project right here at the bottom. And it's going to update any of the types it needs to, in case yours isn't reloading. So next thing is let's create a schema folder. So on the root layer, I want to create a new folder called schema. And inside of the schema folder, let's call this schemas. Inside of this, let's just create a file called index.ts. And this is where we're going to define the types for the register schema. So I'm going to copy those over, and we are using Zod, and we do get the package when we initialized the form from Shadcn. So as you can see here, we have Zod version 3.24.1. So I'm going to copy what I have here. Okay, so we're importing the asterisk as Z from Zod. So we're reporting all from Zod. We created a register schema function, and we're exporting it. And then we're defining the types for the email, the name, the password, and the password confirmation. So the email, name, password, and password confirmation all must be a string. And then as you can see, I did on the password, you need a minimum of 6 characters. And then the error message will be right here. Password must be at least 6 characters long. Password must be at least 6 characters long. So this is the register schema. If we go back to the register form, we need to make sure this is updating. So let's just reset the TypeScript server. And as you can see now, there's no error because it's able to find this import of register schema. Next thing is let's create these components. So I'm going to copy and paste these over. So inside of the components folder in the auth, this is where we're working in. We're going to have an auth header.tsx. This is just allowing us to create different headers dynamically based on passing arguments through of title and label, and then just displaying them in the auth header. We also have a back button that could be dynamic based on where you want to go. We have the card wrapper, which is just creating a card and essentially creating the wrapper of the login and register form. So if you remember, it was a card in the middle of the screen. And as you can see, it is using the card component from Shadcn. So let's go over, get the card component, and initialize it with the CLI. And now we should have this specific import inside of our components folder. And that's going to be inside the UI folder as well. So now we have the card wrapper, everything looks good. The backbone looks good. The auth header looks good. The form error, we are using React icons, so we don't have that. So let's install this package. So npm I React icons. You could also use Lucid React icons, but for this specific, we're going to use React icons. So that fixes that error. We have Lucid React, and Lucid React is auto imported when you initialize Shadcn. So you don't have to install that package. So that's why you didn't see me install this. And then the register form has 2 errors left. We have the Google login, which I'm just going to remove for now because we're going to create a custom. And then we have the register action. So let me just remove that as well now. Okay, so we have all the imports that we need for the register form. Next, what I want to do is I do want to copy the TSX, so like what's being displayed on the page inside of the return. So I'm going to paste everything inside the return. I could just comment the Google login out for now. And then also too, we have to set some state. So like the error state, the success, and I'm also setting the loading state. And now that we have React 19, you can use the use form status or other React hooks that allow you to keep track of the pending state. But for this tutorial, we are just going to store the loading state inside of use state. So what we are going to do here is let's create a few state at the top. So one of them is going to be loading and set loading, which is false. The other one is going to be the error state. And the other one is going to be the success state. So that is going to fix these errors right here. So the error and success. But the setter function is in setting the value of the success and error yet. So we have to do that. And we are also getting an error on the form. So if you look at the documentation, you're going to understand why. But I kind of already know what's going on. So we're going to say const form. And this is going to equal the use form hook, right? And inside of the use form hook, we are going to have the resolver, which is going to be the Zod resolver. And then we're passing in the schema. So it's going to be the register schema. And what this line does, it is taking in the register schema and checking the form to make sure the types are matching with the schema file we just created. So that schema file we created in here, it's making sure that these types are matching the types when somebody fills out this form below. So as you can see, we have a form field with the form item and then the input. So as you see the input, this one's going to be email, name, password, and confirm password. And we are making sure that anything that's accepted within the form is matching the types when it comes to the register schema. Another thing is we have to define the type out here before we pass in the options. So what we could do is we could do z.infer, and it is going to be type of, and it's going to be register schema. And let's just make sure that everything looks good. I think I'm missing another bracket here, and everything is good now. And now we could also define the default values inside of the form use form hook. And the default values we are going to have is going to be empty strings for all 4, because initially the form isn't going to have anything filled out for the input. So that's why those are all empty strings. Okay. And then as you can see, the capitalized form, which we get from the form from the component, is wrapping everything and is passing through all of the actual form. It's a spread syntax through the form. And then we have an HTML form inside of it with the onSubmit, and then the form.handleSubmit is going to equal the onSubmit function. So what we have to do is we have to create an onSubmit function. So that means when they submit the form, this function is going to be called. It is going to be asynchronous. And what this is going to take in, it's going to take in the data, and it is going to be of type z.infer register schema. So we are checking the types to make sure everything looks good. And what we could do initially is we could set loading to be true. So that means we can now display loading state while we run our asynchronous function. And then what we can do here is we could call the server action. So what they're doing inside of this file is they're registering for an account with all of this information. So what we can do is we could call an action called register. And then what we can do inside is we could pass the data like this. So we are going to minimize all of the folders and files here. Let's create another folder on the root layer called actions. And inside of the actions, we are going to have a register.ts file. Register.ts file like this. And this is where we are going to label this as the use server. So this is going to be a server file. We are going to import all as z from Zod. We are also going to import Prisma, so we could use this. And this is coming from, let me make sure I'm importing that correctly. This is going to be where we initiate the Prisma client. So we're exporting it as a named export. So yes, it's going to come from this specific file. And it's going to come from @ it should be Prisma and then / Prisma like that. So that is the path. Another thing we want to do is we need to encrypt the password. So before you send the user back to the backend, we do need to encrypt it. So we're going to use bcrypt, and this is going to come from bcrypt.js. You're going to get an error thrown because we haven't installed this package. So first, let's install the package, npmi bcrypt.js. And then we're still going to get an error because you do have to install the types as well. So if you do hover over it after, it's going to say try npmi and then -- save at types bcrypt.js. So we're just going to copy that and then install the big bcrypt.js types as well. And then give it a few seconds and this should fix itself and we're ready to use the package. The next thing we also want to import is the schema. So the register schema. Like I said, this is just defining the types inside of that schemas folder. And then after that, that's it for now. We are going to add some email functionality in a different part of this video. But for this part, we're just going to work on registering the user. So we're going to say export const register. It's going to be an asynchronous function. And what this is going to take in is the data. And the reason why is because we are passing data here. And what we can do is let's import this from the actions folder because we are exporting it. And this data is going to be of type z.infer. And it'll be a type of register schema. Okay, so let's do a try catch on the backend. And inside, let's validate the input data. So to do that, we're going to say const validated data is going to equal the register schema dot, we have the method parse, and then we're going to parse the data like that. And then we could do a check. So if this is a falsy value or the data is not validated, what we can do is instead of throwing a new error, we are just going to return. And this is going to be error. And what we can say is invalid input data. So we're just making sure the input data is correct and we're checking it on both on the client and the server. Next, what we are going to do is let's destructure the validated data. So we are going to have an email, a name, a password, and a password confirmation. And this is coming from the validated data variable right here. So after that, we need to check to see if the passwords match. So first, if password doesn't equal password confirmation, we are just going to return an error saying passwords do not match. If they do match, then let's hash the password. So we're going to say const hashed password, and we are going to use the bcrypt.hash method. And what that takes in, the first param is the password. So if you hover over hash, as you can see, it takes in a s, which is a string to hash. So that's going to be the password because the password is the string to hash. And the next one is the salt, which is the salt length to generate or salt to use. So bcrypt uses this in the backend as a number to generate the hashed password. So that's all done for them. And 10 is used by default, but we are going to put it there for now. After that, we are going to see if the user already exists in the database. So we're going to say const user exist equals await. And we are going to use Prisma now, the Prisma client, right? So we're going to say Prisma dot user dot, and we are going to do find first. And inside the find first, we're going to say we're the email. So we're trying to see, we're getting the email from the validated data, which is the input. And we're saying if there's a user exist that is associated with the email. And the reason why we're using email is if you look at the schema.prisma file, email is a unique field. So that means there's only one email per person. So that's why we could use the find first method to see who has this specific email. And if somebody does have this email, that means there's a user in the database. So what we're going to do is if user exists, we are going to return an error that says user already exists. Next, what I want to do is, this is a problem I ran into when actually creating the authentication system for chat build, is that in some databases, everything could be case sensitive. So what I want to do is I want to do a lowercase email, and we are going to lowercase all of the letters inside of the email input. So sometimes somebody might put a capital on accident and it could throw off your database, which that's what it was doing to me. So that's why I have this, and I'm using a simple JavaScript method to lowercase. So it's going to lowercase every letter inside of email to lowercase. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to create the user. So we're going to say const user equals await Prisma dot user dot create. And what we can do here is we could have the data object like that, and inside that we are going to pass in what we want to our database. So we're going to say email is going to be the lowercase email. We are going to say password. That could be the hash password, and then we also have name, which is just going to be the name. So if you're passing everything in correctly, there should be no errors. But if you didn't generate your Prisma client, then your Prisma client isn't up to date with your schema, and this could be throwing an error saying you either need to add an extra field or you added a field that shouldn't be there. So make sure your Prisma client is updated by running npx prisma generate. And then after that, what we're going to do is we are just going to return a success, and we're going to say user created successfully. That's just for now. In the other parts of the video, we are going to send verification emails. So we're going to have to come back to the register, but that's going to be in a separate part of the video. But for now, we're just doing the register. And what we want to do here is we could do a handle. So we could just do in the catch, we could do a console.error, and then we could also return an error occurred. You could obviously handle the catch a lot better, but for this video's tutorial sake, that is good enough. Press Ctrl S to make sure everything looks good. And that should be it for the server action for the register. This is going to register a user into your MongoDB database using the Prisma client and the ORM. So now let's go back to the register form, which is the client side of where we're calling that server action. So we have register.data, and then we could do the .then, which that means if successful. We're going to have a response, which is short for res, and then we're going to do a code block, and then let's do an if statement. So we're going to say if there is a res.error. So that means any of these errors. So for example, the res is the response. So if we look at the register, anytime we send a response, so anytime we send a return, we can have a res.error, or we could have a res.success. That's why I'm returning it like this, or I'm returning with an error like this. So what we can do here is for the res.success, this else shouldn't be here. We should do, it's not going to be an else if, or if else, sorry. It's going to be if res.success, then we're going to return this. So that's not going to be undefined anymore. So what this is doing, if there is a res.error, we're going to set the error to the response.error, and we're going to set the success to an empty string. And if there is a success, we're just going to set the error to an empty string and set the success message to the response.success message. And then also too, what you want to do is to make sure you end the loading state, set loading to false on both of them. Because if you are showing like a loader, we do want the loader to stop. So make sure the loader stops. And what we can do is we can set loading to false at the top of each if statement. Okay, so that should be everything. And the success message should display in the form success component that we run to here, or the error message is going to display if there's an error in the form error component right here. And like I said, I have the GitHub repo here, so you can see how the success UI is and how the error UI is as well. So let's test this out. So we're going to do npm run dev. And another cool way you could view your database is you can install a shortcut or an application called MongoDB Compass. And you're going to see this pop up, and it's going to look something similar to this. So we could connect to a database right here in the URI, and the URI is going to be inside of your .env file, and it's going to be the connection string. So we're just going to copy this whole connection string, right? Paste it here, and then press connect. And as you can see, we have the users collection here with an account and a user, right? So we do have already a user in the database when it comes to this one that we're doing right now. So this is the one we signed up with Google on the pre-built check-in page. So I'm going to delete this user, and I'm also going to delete the account. And now that we have our local development server running, let's go to localhost 3000. And let's test out this register form and see how it looks. So let's just go to /register, because that is the page we created. And it should be rendering the register form. And as you can see, it is not centered. So what we can do for this specifically is we can actually create a route group. So to do that, what you can do is you go back to the code. Let's close all of the files up. And what I want to do is, instead of just having it inside of the register path or the URL, let's create another folder in the app called auth. And then let's move the register folder into the auth folder. Okay, so the path is going to be localhost 3000 /auth and then /register. So that is the page path that we are going to go to now. And now what we can do inside of this route group is we can create a layout, right? Like I was saying, this is going to affect any file that is within this auth folder. So we are going to create a new file and call this layout.tsx. And if we create another folder in here called login, which we're going to need anyway. So we have a login page, which we haven't created yet or made publicly facing because we have no page.tsx. And then we have the register page. And this layout, make sure it's inside of the auth folder. So this layout is going to affect everything, every path inside of the auth folder, which is the login and register. So hopefully that makes sense. That is a Next.js concept solely. So inside of the layout, it's going to almost replicate how your root layout looks. I'm just going to copy and paste it over because this is just some stuff that is mainly UI stuff. And what we have here is we are taking in the children as a argument, and we are defining the type. And all the children, like I said, are going to be the pages within this specific route group. And we just have a section, and we have some Tailwindcss styling here that is going to center the login and register cards. So if we go back to our application and go to /auth /register, now you can see the page is centered, and I'm zoomed in 150%. So this is how it looks at 100%. And as you can see, these dots here, this grid is defined inside of that layout.tsx file. As you can see, it's here. So that is why that grid is there. It's defined right there. So let me just zoom this back in so you guys can see better. And we are going to test it out because it should call the action. So let's do an email. Let's do a name. Let's do a password. And let's do a password that doesn't match just to see if it throws an error message. So passwords do not match, which it's good. And now let's do the correct passwords and let's click register. So user was created successfully. So we did get a success message. If we look, we only get the success message inside of the server action if all of these checks pass, and we also created the user in the database. So what we can do is we can go to MongoDB Compass. Let's look at our database, and as you can see, we have a user with a hashed password and all of the fields that are required in there for the user, but doesn't have an account because that's only for the Google provider. But every user, even if it's an account, must have a user model. So that is us creating the register form. Now let's work on the login form, which is going to really use the credentials provider to authenticate the user when logged in. So for the login UI, let's do it the same way. Let's create the Tailwind CSS of that and just copy and paste over. So inside the login folder, let's create a page.tsx. And inside of that page.tsx, we are going to do RAFCE, call this login page. And then what we can do is we could just name this login form. And then the login form, what we're going to do is we're just going to copy and paste it over. So let's see if we have to add anything else for the login form. So in the components inside of the auth, let's create a new file called login-form.tsx. Let's paste everything in there. And we're going to have a few errors, which is fine. So it looks like we are using the same setup when it comes to components. All we need is the login schema. We could do the Google login after we're done. So we need the login schema. So let's go to our schemas folder, and inside the index.ts, let's copy and paste the login schema there as well. So we're going to copy it underneath. And as you can see, the login only takes in the email and the password. So if we go over here, back to the login form, everything looks good. And let's also import the login form inside of the login page. And the other thing we're missing is the action. So as you can see, we have the same thing with a form. And then when the form is submitted, we have an onSubmit function called. And then what we're doing is we are receiving data from this useForm hook. And that's why we're accepting it here. And we're defining the types and make sure they match up with the login schema. We set the loading to true. And then we also are, if there's response.error, we're doing that. Else, we're setting the error to that, and we're set the loading to false. And what we want to do is inside of the login, let's create an action called login. So we're going to say login.ts. And now let's actually work on this specific action that is going to utilize the credentials provider. So we're going to say use server. And let me just copy all of these imports over instead of wasting my time writing them. And what we can do here is we could create a function export const login equals an asynchronous function. This is going to take in the data. And first thing we need to do is we need to validate the data on the server side. So we're going to say validated data. And this is going to be the login schema.parse method taking in the data. And we're going to say if it is falsy, we are going to return an error saying invalid input data. We could do whatever error message you want. Next, let's destructure the validated data, which is the email and password. And then we are going to check to see if the user exists. So user exists equals await, and it's going to be prisma.user.find first. And we are going to find it based off of the email that's provided. So we're going to say if there's no user that exists, then we are going to return an error saying user not found. And then also too, we need to do a few other checks. We're going to say, or if there is no user exist dot password. And the reason why we're doing this is because if they have a Google provider login, which they always log in with their Google account, they're never going to have a password field with inside the user model. And the only way you can log in with this login action is by having a password. That's how the credentials provider works. So that's why you have to add this or check. And another check we could do is we could say, or the user exists dot email, or if there's no user exists dot email. So make sure it's a not. So you have exclamation mark in front of each one. Okay, so now we could do a try catch. And inside of the try, we are going to use a function from Auth.js called signIn. So what we can do is we could await, and we're going to call it signIn. And this should come from Auth.js. So let's just make sure we're exporting it from there, which we are actually. I actually imported it at the top initially. So as you can see, we're getting the signIn function from the @/auth, which is this auth.ts file, which we defined it right here, the signIn. So that's how we're using that. And the signIn allows us to define the provider we want to sign in with, and then it gives us the option to pass in data and do a few other things we need to do. So what this is going to do is, as you can see, we need the provider, and the provider, if you just press a string, it should populate a bunch of different providers that Auth.js allows you to use. And what we're going to be using is, of course, the credentials provider. And then let's pass a comma. And then inside of the comma, we have to pass in the data, right? So the email, which is going to be the user exist.email, and the password, which is just going to be the password, like that. And then there is another option we can do. So if you press Control space, you can see they have a redirect and a redirect to. So we're going to use the redirect to. And then we are just going to redirect to, say, a dashboard page, right? We don't have a dashboard page created, but we'll redirect it there, and it's going to be a 404 page not found. But you're going to see in the URL if it is everything was successful, right? And then inside of the catch, I'm going to copy this over real quick. Let me just copy this and explain what it is. So inside the catch, we're using if error is instance of auth error. So we're importing auth error at the top. And if you look at the documentation, auth error gives a bunch of different codes depending on the error that auth.js is throwing. So we are just saying if the error.type is credentials sign in, then you're going to return the error invalid credentials. Else, by default, we're just going to throw an error saying, please confirm your email address. So there must be something wrong with the email address, and you need to confirm it. And then all we're going to do is throw the error. And then after this, we do have to have a return statement. So we are going to return, and it's going to be success. And then what we could do is user logged in successfully, like that. All right, so we can press Control S, and everything looks good on this side of the server action. So this is our login server action. And if it passes all of these checks, just to make sure all of the data is correct, we are running the try catch, and we are calling the sign-in function from Auth.js, and we're passing the email, the password, and we have a redirect to the dashboard. Let's go back to the login. And it is saying response has any type. So for right now, let me just make sure this is everything's correct. It's saying it can't find the actions /login. So let me just do a Control-Shift-P, and let's reset the TypeScript server, because you should be able to find that. So we do have one error, and we have the Google login. So let's just comment that out, and we'll work on that after we are completely done with the credentials. So now everything looks good on the login page. Let's see if it's actually populating correctly. So we're going to go auth/login like this, press enter. And as you can see, the login page looks good to go, right? All the UI looks good, and we have to do the email password. And when we submit our login, we are calling that action we just created. So we're not done yet with the login functionality because we are calling the credentials provider. So if you remember, if you go back to the auth.config.ts, we have to now set up the credential provider when it's called. So that signIn function is going to call this right here. And it's going to be the same method when we call Google. So we're going to have a signIn function from Auth.js, and it's going to call the Google provider. So for the credentials provider, what we have to do is let's start creating it. And what this is going to have, it is going to have an asynchronous function called authorize, right? And this authorize is going to take in the credentials, which is going to be the email and password that we passed in inside of the sign in. So let me go back to that action. It's going to take in the email and password as credentials right here. So what we can do is we can do const. We could validate the data just to make sure everything is still validated. We are going to have the login schema, and then we could do a safe parse, and it'll be credentials. And what the safe parse does, it is going to return a true false value, or no, a success value. It's going to return success or error value. So what we can do here is we can do a check. So if there is no validated success, then we are going to return null like this. Next is we can destructure from the validated data. So it's going to be the email and password like that. After that, we are going to then make sure we get the user, right? So we're going to say const user, and we are going to await, and then we can do Prisma dot user dot find first, and we are going to find it by email like that. So we're using the Prisma client, and then after that we could do a checks. If there's no user, there's no user.password, or there's no user.email, we are going to return null. So right now we're just doing a bunch of checks. Another check we have to do when they log in is to see if the passwords match. So passwords match. And this is going to equal await bcrypt dot compare. And what we have to do is we have to import bcrypt at the top. So we have to do this manually because it's not giving us the auto import. And this is coming from bcrypt.js. And we are going to compare the password. So that's the password we're receiving from the user.password, which is the one in the database. And it is going to decode the hashed password and compare them. That's what bcrypt is doing. Next, we're going to say if passwords match. So we're going to say if passwords match, we are going to return the user. And then else, if after that, if it's not passing, we are just going to return null. So this is the credentials provider. It takes in a function, an asynchronous function called authorize that accepts credentials. And the credentials is the data that we passed into it from the signIn function. So the email and the password. And then all we're doing here is we're doing checks to see if the types are correct. We are destructuring. We're finding the user in the database. We're making sure that it has a password, email, and a user. We're checking to see if passwords match, and if they do match, we are just going to return the user, and they're going to be able to log in and get redirected to the dashboard. Okay, so let's refresh the page, and we could go to inspect, and what you can do is you could always check your cookies. So as you can see, you have some cookies here. Let's just clear all the cookies. What we can do is just do this, and then delete every cookie. And we can refresh the page, and now let's try to log in. So we're going to do a login. And I'm using the correct login information, so let's log in, see if it works. And what it did is it did redirect us to the dashboard. And then as you can see here inside of the cookies, we do have a token, which we're using the JWT provider, right? And as you can see, if you ever use JWT tokens, this does look like the structure of the JWT cookie value. And this is the cookie value that Auth.js handles and makes sure to authenticate you with. So we are logged in, and just to make sure that we are logged in 100%, what you can do is inside of the app folder, create another folder called dashboard. And then we're going to create a new file called page.tsx. Let's create a React functional component, call this the dashboard page. And inside of the dashboard page, what we can do is to get the user session, we're going to import, it's going to be called auth from @auth. And to be able to show the information of the user, like their details, you have to use this auth right here. And what we can do is we can do const session, whatever you want to call it, equals await auth, and then call it like this. And then this has to be a synchronous function, and it must be a server component. If you do use a client component, you can use the use session hook, but it was always recommended to try to do it inside of a server component. So what we can do here is we can just console.log the session and see what we get. So we are on the dashboard. So let's go to the console. And as you can see, we are getting a user in the console, and we are getting expires, which that's when the JWT expires. And we're getting a user with email, image, and name. So that means we are logged in. And if we do, like I said, delete these cookie. So delete the cookie, go back to the console, refresh. You see the server, we have null. So that means there's no user. So that cookie is authenticating a user and allowing them to be logged in. So now the credentials provider is completed, at least the bare bones portion of it where it gets you to log in a user. There's going to be a lot more functionality we do in different parts of the video, but the next step is let's work on the Google provider, which we already have done. I just want to show you guys how you can set up a button. So all they have to do is click the button. It'll verify that they want to log in with this specific Google account, and they're going to be able to log in instead of from that pre-built page that we did about 50 minutes ago. So to log in with the Google provider, we have to use the signIn function from our auth.ts file, just like we did with the credential provider. So first thing we should do is we are going to go to our actions, create a new file, and we could call this google-login.ts like this. And what we are going to do is we are going to find the use server at the top. We are going to import signIn. And this is coming from @/auth. We are also going to import the auth error from next-auth. And we are going to export an async function. And we're going to call this Google authenticate. And this function right here, it is going to have a try catch. Inside of the try, we are going to await the signIn function, and we are passing in the provider, which is Google, just like this. And then if you want, you can have a callback, but for us, we're just going to keep it simple as that. And then for the, in the catch, we're gonna have an if. So if error is instance of auth error, like this, what we are going to do is we are going to return a string called Google log and failed, just like that. And then we are just going to throw the error. Okay, so we have created the action, and this is going to be called when we click the Google login button. So next, let's create the login button. So inside of the components in the auth folder, we are going to create a new file called google-button.tsx. And what we are going to do here is this is going to be a use client. And what we are going to do is we're going to import the action we just created. So we called it Google authenticate. So we're going to authenticate with Google. We can also import the use action state. And this is coming from React. This is a new hook. inside of React 19, it is going to allow us to call server actions and also retrieve the data, pending state, loading state, errors, stuff like that. And it's going to be a hook that is going to be used more and more often now, since it is pretty new and server actions are becoming a lot more popular. We're also going to get a React icon of the Google button from React Icons, and we're also going to get the button component from Shadcn. Let's say const Google login. This is going to be an arrow function, and let's define the use action state. So what we can accept in here is we're going to get the error message, and then we could just call this Google. You could call this error if you wanted, and then we are going to call dispatch Google, just like that. And this is going to equal the use action state. And then the first argument it takes in is the action. So this is going to be Google authenticate. And then the other one is going to be the initial state, and that initially is going to be undefined, just like that. And if we go to the documentation for use action state, you can see all of the documentation of what we're doing here and what it takes in, and then also what we receive back when the action actually runs. And then they have examples as well. So let's go back to our code, and inside of it, let's have the return statement. And inside the return statement, we are going to have an HTML form. And inside the form, let's use the Shadcn button. Let's close the button too. And the form is going to have this specific styling, which I'm just going to copy over, not too much, a flex and a margin top of 4. We are going to have the action. We're going to call the action inside the form when the form is submitted. It's going to be dispatch Google. So what we called it right here. And then inside the button, we are going to have some styling as well. So the button is going to have a variant of outline, flex row, item center, gap 3, and a width of full. And inside the button, let's render the Google. So the Google logo. And then we could just have a Google sign in like this. So text like that. And then underneath the button inside the form, what we can do is we could display a p tag. And just in case we get an error, we could display the error, right? So it's going to be error message Google like that. And then at the end, let's export default and then Google login like that. So now let's use this function, which is creating a button in a form that calls our action inside of the register form and the login form. So to do that, let's just copy this. Let's go to the login form. Let's import Google login, right? And this is coming from the path of /Google-button. And let's go down here below and let's uncomment this. And the function name is going to be called Google login, and this is going to be displaying as a button underneath the form for us to log in with Google. And let's do the same thing for the register form. Let's uncheck it down below. And then also import it at the top, right? So import Google login from the Google-button. Okay, so now let's test it out. So let's see if it's actually rendering on the page. So let's go to our application, refresh, and as you can see, the Google sign-in button's there. So now let's try it out and test it. So let's click it. And as you can see, it takes us to choose which account we want to log in with. So far everything is working good. Let's try to log in with a different account. So I'm going to try this email. And we're going to press continue. And what we could do to make sure we logged in is we could go to the application. And as you can see, we do have tokens, which it is following us. And then if you wanted to redirect to the dashboard, you can. But let's just manually go to it. And let's see if anything is displaying in the console. So let's go to the console. And if you look at the console, we do have a user. And the user is the email that I just logged in with, the image, which we're getting from the Google provider, and the name. So we now have successfully logged in and authenticated with the credentials provider and the Google provider. So I know this part 2 was maybe a little drawn out. I tried to explain everything I can to the best of my ability, and I didn't want to skip too many things. I don't mind skipping the CSS, but I do feel it is important to talk about creating the register action and the Google login action, and how to kind of set up the form on the UI side and to use the use action state hook and stuff like that. So I know this video is like 20% Auth.js, but it is very important to have the other 80% done, because if you don't, everything works in hand together. And if something is messed up, even if it's not the authentication part, it could definitely throw off the Auth.js and make it not work. So hopefully you guys liked part 2. Thank you guys if you watched part 1 and part 2. Really do appreciate you guys watching the content. And in part 3, we are going to go over asynchronous callbacks and different events that we can call when a certain action is called. So for example, if you log in, we only want to make sure you're logged in if you have a verified email, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create the verified email token and also send it to them so we can make sure their email is verified via the credentials provider and stuff like that. And then there's a bunch of asynchronous callbacks like the JWT in session, which are very powerful in adding more fields and attributes to the user that we can display to them. So right now, all you see is the email, image, and name. So that's the only things we could display to them. But through the asynchronous callbacks, we can actually get more information within the user and then be able to display them as well. So hopefully you guys tune in to part 3. And for part 2, if you guys did like the video, hit that thumbs up and also subscribe for content just like this. But other than that, you guys have a good day and look forward to part 3 tomorrow. Thanks.